The blizzard came out of nowhere that December afternoon in 1885, turning the Wyoming territory into a white hell that swallowed everything in its path. Thomas Ashford pulled his hat lower and urged his horse forward through the driving snow, cursing himself for staying too long in town when he had seen the clouds gathering on the horizon. He knew better than most what these mountains could do to a man caught unprepared, but the meeting with the Cattlemen's Association had run long, and now he was paying the price for his tardiness. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and visibility had shrunk to mere feet in front of his gelding's frost-covered nose. He had been riding for what felt like hours, though it could have been less, when something dark appeared in the snow ahead. Thomas squinted against the icy pellets stinging his face, trying to make sense of the shape that did not belong to the landscape. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree or perhaps a deer bedded down against the storm, but as he drew closer, his heart seized in his chest. It was a person, a woman by the looks of her, collapsed in a drift with snow already beginning to cover her still form. Thomas dismounted so quickly, he nearly lost his footing on the treacherous ground. He dropped to his knees beside her, brushing snow from her face with trembling hands that had nothing to do with the cold. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark hair plastered to pale cheeks and lips that had taken on a dangerous blue tint. Her clothing was wholly inadequate for the weather, just a thin traveling dress and a shawl that had provided no protection against the elements. She was not moving, and for a terrible moment, Thomas thought he had found her too late. He pressed his fingers to her throat, searching for a pulse, and nearly sobbed with relief when he felt a faint flutter beneath her cold skin. She was alive, but barely, and if he did not get her warm soon, she would not remain that way for long. Thomas did not hesitate. He scooped her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, how fragile, and struggled back to his feet. Getting her onto his horse while keeping his own balance proved challenging, but desperation lent him strength. He settled her in front of the saddle, then mounted behind her, wrapping his heavy coat around them both as best he could. She remained unconscious, her head lolling against his chest. The ride back to his ranch took twice as long as it should have, with Thomas forced to let his horse pick its way carefully through snow that had drifted knee-deep in places. He kept the woman pulled tight against him, trying to share what little warmth his body could provide, talking to her in a low voice even though she could not hear him. He told her to hold on, that she would be all right, that he would not let her die out here in the frozen wasteland. He told her things he would never have said to a conscious person, promises that came from some deep place in his chest he had not accessed in years. By the time the dark shape of his ranch house materialized through the curtain of snow, Thomas could barely feel his own extremities. He half fell from the saddle, dragging the woman down with him, and stumbled toward the door. His fingers were so numb he fumbled with the latch 3 times before managing to get it open. The interior of the house was blessedly warm, the fire he had banked that morning still glowing in the hearth, and Thomas kicked the door shut behind them before carrying his burden straight to the bedroom. He laid her on his bed, then rushed to build up the fire in the small stove that heated the room. His hands shook as he added kindling and logs, coaxing the flames higher. Only when heat began to pour from the cast iron did he turn back to the woman. Her clothes were soaked through, crusted with ice in places, and Thomas knew he had to get her out of them. It felt wrong, violating somehow, but it was necessary if she was going to survive. He worked as quickly and respectfully as he could, averting his eyes as much as possible while he peeled away the wet layers. Her skin was so cold it frightened him, pale and waxy looking. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, tucking them around her shivering form, then added his own heavy quilt on top. Still, she did not wake, though her breathing seemed a bit stronger now that she was out of the wet clothes. Thomas spent the next several hours in a chair pulled close to the bed, watching her with an intensity born of fear and something else he could not quite name. He had warmed water on the stove and used clean cloths to gently clean her face and hands, wiping away the grime of travel. She was beautiful, he realized, though that seemed like an inadequate word. There was something about the curve of her cheek, the dark sweep of her lashes against her skin, that made his chest tighten. He tried to get her to drink a little warm broth, supporting her head and coaxing the liquid between her lips, but most of it dribbled down her chin. Thomas persisted, patient and determined, until he managed to get perhaps a quarter cup into her. It was not much, but it was something. Night fell early as it always did in winter, and the storm continued to rage outside. Thomas knew he should tend to his horse, still standing outside in the blizzard, and guilt gnawed at him. But the gelding was hardy and had weathered storms before. The woman was fragile, hanging onto life by a thread, and he could not bring himself to leave her side. He compromised by darting out long enough to put the horse in the barn with food and water, then hurried back to his post. Sometime past midnight, she began to stir. Small movements at first, just a twitch of her fingers, then her eyelids fluttered. Thomas leaned forward, his heart hammering. Her eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding their brown depths as she tried to focus on his face. "Easy now," Thomas said softly. "You are safe. You were caught in the storm." She stared at him for a long moment, then her gaze traveled around the unfamiliar room. Panic flashed across her features and she tried to sit up, but her body would not cooperate. A small sound of distress escaped her lips. "Please do not be afraid," Thomas said quickly. "I found you in the snow. I brought you here to my ranch. You were near frozen to death." He kept his voice gentle, non-threatening, though his pulse raced with relief that she had woken at all. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. She swallowed hard, then tried again. "Where?" The word was barely a whisper, rough and cracked. "My ranch, about 5 miles outside of Anston, Wyoming territory," Thomas told her. "Can you tell me your name? What were you doing out in that storm?" Her brow furrowed as if the question required great effort to answer. "Delilah," she finally managed. "Delilah Anderson. The stage overturned. Everyone ran. I tried to follow, but I got lost in the snow." Thomas felt his stomach drop. He had heard nothing about a stage accident, but in this weather, news might not reach town for days. Was anyone hurt? How many others were there? "I do not know," Delilah said, and tears began to slide down her temples into her hair. "The driver maybe was dead. I think the horses broke free. The other passengers just scattered. I called for them, but no one answered." "Where were you headed?" "Evanston," she whispered. "To meet my cousin. She runs a dress shop there. I was supposed to work for her." Thomas nodded slowly, filing away this information. "Well, you are safe now. We will worry about finding the others once the storm passes. Right now you need to rest and get your strength back." Delilah's eyes were already drifting closed again, exhaustion claiming her. Thomas watched her slip back into sleep, this time more natural than the unconsciousness that had gripped her before. He settled back in his chair, knowing he would not leave this room until he was certain she was out of danger. The next 3 days passed in a strange sort of intimacy, as Thomas tended to Delilah's recovery. The storm blew itself out by the second morning, leaving behind a world transformed into an ocean of white that would take weeks to melt. Thomas sent word to town about the stage accident as soon as the roads were passable on horseback, and learned that 2 other passengers had made it to safety at a neighboring ranch. The driver had indeed perished, which grieved Delilah terribly when Thomas told her. But during those early days, practical matters took precedence over grief. Delilah's feet had suffered frostbite, making walking painful, and she was weak as a newborn foal. Thomas cooked for her, simple fare of stew and biscuits, and helped her sit up to eat. He warmed bricks on the stove and wrapped them in cloth to tuck around her feet. He read to her from the few books he owned, his deep voice filling the quiet rooms of his house with stories of adventure and far-off places. Delilah proved to be a gracious patient despite her obvious discomfort with the situation. "You must have work to do," she said one afternoon, as Thomas sat beside the bed with his mending. "I cannot keep you from your duties any longer." "The cattle are fine for now," Thomas assured her. "I have 2 hands who live in the bunkhouse. They can manage the feeding. You need looking after." "But this is not proper," Delilah protested, color rising in her cheeks. "An unmarried woman staying alone with a bachelor. What will people think?" Thomas set down his mending and met her eyes. "People can think what they like. I was not about to leave you to freeze to death just to protect your reputation. And I am not about to throw you out now before you are healed." She looked away, worrying her lower lip between her teeth. "You have been nothing but kind." "I did not mean to sound ungrateful. I just do not wish to cause you any trouble." "You are no trouble," Thomas said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Having another person in the house, even one confined to bed, had broken up the loneliness he had grown so accustomed to that he barely noticed it anymore. The sound of her voice, her presence, made the place feel more like a home than it had in all the years since he had built it. As Delilah's strength returned, she became more alert and talkative. Thomas learned she was 22 years old, originally from Ohio, and had lost both her parents to influenza the previous winter. Her cousin Margaret in Evanston was her only remaining family, which was why she had undertaken the dangerous winter journey west. She had been a schoolteacher before her parents' death, but the school board had not renewed her contract when she had to miss so much time caring for her sick mother and father. "I am good with a needle," Delilah told him. Margaret wrote that she needed help with her dressmaking business. It seemed like a godsend, a chance to start fresh somewhere new. Thomas told her about himself as well, how he had come to Wyoming 10 years ago when he was just 18, working as a ranch hand until he saved enough to buy his own land. He had built this ranch from nothing, enduring harsh winters and drought, stampedes and disease, until he had finally carved out something that was his. He was 28 now, and the work had made him strong but also solitary. He had never had much time for courting, and the few women in the area were either already married or too young. "It gets lonely," he admitted one evening as they sat by the fire in the main room. Delilah was finally strong enough to leave the bedroom, wrapped in blankets on his worn sofa. "But I suppose that is just the price of this life." Delilah looked at him thoughtfully. "It does not have to be. Plenty of ranchers have families." "I suppose I never met the right woman," Thomas said, "or maybe I was just too busy surviving to notice." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that made Thomas's pulse quicken. He looked away first, suddenly flustered in a way he had not been since he was a boy. This was dangerous ground, these feelings that had been growing in him since he first carried her into his home. She was his guest, under his protection, vulnerable. He had no right to think of her as anything more than that. But as the days passed and Delilah grew stronger, Thomas found it increasingly difficult to ignore the warmth that spread through his chest whenever she smiled at him. She had taken to helping around the house despite his protests, mending his shirts and organizing his chaotic kitchen. She cooked meals that were far better than anything he had managed on his own, and sang while she worked, filling the house with music. "You have made this place a home," Thomas said one afternoon, the words escaping before he could stop them. Delilah paused in her task of kneading bread dough, flour dusting her hands and forearms. "It is the least I can do after all you have done for me." "I did not mean it like a criticism," Thomas said quickly. "I meant it as nice. I like coming in from the cold and hearing you here. The house feels different, better." She smiled at him, shy and pleased, and Thomas felt his heart do something strange in his chest. Lord, he was in trouble. A week and a half after he had found her, a rider came from town bearing a message from Delilah's cousin. Margaret Anderson had been beside herself with worry when Delilah had not arrived on the expected stage, and the news of the accident had only increased her fears. She was overjoyed to learn her cousin had survived and invited Thomas to bring Delilah to town as soon as she was well enough to travel. Thomas read the letter aloud to Delilah, watching her face light up at the confirmation that her cousin was real and waiting for her. He should have been glad. This was what she needed, to be reunited with her family and start the life she had come west to build. But selfishly, Thomas felt his stomach sink at the thought of her leaving. "I can take you tomorrow if you feel up to it," he offered. "The roads are clear enough now. Tomorrow." Delilah repeated, and he thought he heard disappointment in her voice. "I suppose that would be best. I have imposed on you long enough." "You have not imposed," Thomas said firmly, "but you must be eager to see your cousin." "Of course," Delilah said, but she did not sound entirely convinced. That night, their last together, felt heavy with things unsaid. They sat by the fire after supper, and Thomas found himself memorizing the way the firelight played across Delilah's features. How had she become so essential to him in such a short time? It seemed impossible, illogical, and yet he could not deny what he felt. "Thomas," Delilah said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "I want to thank you for saving my life. I know I have said it before, but I need you to understand how much it means to me. You risked yourself in that storm. You took me in and cared for me when you had no obligation to do so. I will never forget your kindness." "It was not kindness," Thomas said, the words rough in his throat, "or not just kindness." He stopped, unsure how to continue, afraid of saying too much and ruining what little time they had left. She leaned forward, her eyes searching his face. "You what?" Thomas took a breath and decided to risk it. He might never have another chance. "I am going to miss you," he said. "More than I should, probably. These past days with you here, they have been the happiest I can remember in a very long time. I know that is selfish to say when you are about to start your new life, but I wanted you to know." Delilah's breath caught. "Thomas, I feel the same way. Being here with you, it has felt right in a way nothing else has in so long. I am grateful to have my cousin and the prospect of work, but the thought of leaving this house, leaving you, it breaks my heart." Thomas reached for her hand before he could stop himself, folding her smaller fingers in his. "Then do not go," he said. "Not yet. Stay a while longer. Let me court you properly. Give us a chance to see if this feeling between us is real." "It is real," Delilah whispered. "I know it is. But I cannot ask you to change your life for me. You barely know me." "I know enough," Thomas said. "I know you are brave and strong. I know you have a good heart. I know that when I look at you, I see a future I never let myself imagine before. That is enough for me. The question is whether it is enough for you." Delilah's eyes shone with unshed tears. "It is more than enough, but what about propriety? We cannot continue living here together unmarried. The talk would ruin both our reputations." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "Then we will do it right. You will go stay with your cousin as planned. I will come calling on you in town, bring you flowers, take you to church socials. I will ask your cousin for permission to court you formally. We will do everything by the book so no one can say otherwise." And when enough time has passed that it is respectable, I will ask you to marry me. If you will have me, that is." A tear spilled down Delilah's cheek, but she was smiling. "That is a very presumptuous proposal for a courtship that has not even begun yet, Mr. Ashford." "I am a direct man," Thomas said, "and I know what I want, but I will wait as long as necessary to do this right. You deserve to be courted and wooed, not rushed into something because circumstances threw us together." "You are a good man, Thomas Ashford," Delilah said softly. She turned her hand in his and squeezed back. "Very well. We will do this properly, but know that my answer when you ask me someday will be yes." Thomas felt as if he could float off the ground. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Then I will make sure every day between now and then proves you made the right choice." True to his word, Thomas took Delilah into Evanston the next day. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with businesses and houses spreading out in all directions. Margaret Anderson's dress shop was on the corner of Front Street, a neat little building with living quarters above. Margaret herself came rushing out when she saw them approaching, a plump woman in her 40s with graying hair and Delilah's same warm brown eyes. "Delilah, thank God!" Margaret cried, pulling her cousin into a fierce embrace the moment Delilah climbed down from the wagon. "I was so worried. When I heard about the accident, I thought the worst." "I am all right, thanks to Mr. Ashford," Delilah said, returning the hug just as tightly. "He saved my life." Margaret turned to Thomas with gratitude shining in her eyes. "Sir, I cannot thank you enough. To think of my Delilah out there in that storm if you had not found her." Her voice broke. "I am just glad I came along when I did," Thomas said, uncomfortable with the praise but warmed by it nonetheless. He helped unload Delilah's few belongings, the small trunk that had been recovered from the wreck stage, and accepted Margaret's invitation to come inside for coffee. The dress shop was charming, full of bolts of fabric and partially completed garments on dressmaker forms. The living quarters above were cozy if small, just 2 bedrooms, a sitting room and a kitchen. Margaret fussed over Delilah, exclaiming over her still healing frostbite and insisting she sit down immediately. "You will stay for supper, Mr. Ashford," Margaret said, brooking no argument. "It is the least I can do." Thomas stayed, enjoying a fine meal of roasted chicken and vegetables while Margaret peppered Delilah with questions about her journey and recovery. When there was a lull in the conversation, Thomas cleared his throat. "Miss Anderson, I wonder if I might have a word with you about your cousin." Margaret's eyebrows rose, but she nodded. "Of course. Delilah, dear, why do not you start clearing the dishes?" Thomas followed Margaret into the small sitting room, suddenly nervous in a way he had not been since he was a boy asking permission to take Sarah Miller to a barn dance. "Miss Anderson, I want to ask your permission to court your cousin. I know the circumstances of how we met were unusual, but I assure you my intentions are entirely honorable. I would like the opportunity to get to know Delilah better, with your approval and supervision, of course." Margaret studied him for a long moment, her gaze shrewd. "Delilah told me how you cared for her. That shows good character. But I do not know you, Mr. Ashford. You could be a gambler or a drunk for all I know." "I am neither," Thomas said firmly. "I own a cattle ranch 5 miles east of town. I do not drink more than the occasional whiskey, and I have never gambled for more than pocket change. I attend church when the circuit preacher comes through. I pay my debts and deal honestly with my neighbors. You can ask anyone in town about my character, and they will tell you the same." "I will," Margaret said bluntly. "Make no mistake about that. But assuming your character is as you say, then yes, you may court my cousin. She is of age to make her own decisions, but I appreciate you asking properly. You will call on her here in my presence, at least for the first months. No unchaperoned meetings until I am satisfied you can be trusted." "That is more than fair," Thomas agreed. "And Mr. Ashford, if you hurt her you will answer to me. I may be a dressmaker, but I know how to use my late husband's rifle." Thomas had to smile at that. "Understood, Miss Anderson. I have no intention of hurting her. See that you do not." Over the next weeks, Thomas made good on his promise. He came to town twice a week, on Wednesdays and Sundays, to call on Delilah. He brought her small gifts, wildflowers he had pressed between book pages, a carved wooden bird he whittled by his fire at night, a length of blue ribbon that matched her eyes. They sat in Margaret's parlor with the older woman as chaperone, talking about everything and nothing. Thomas told Delilah about his childhood in Missouri, how his father had been a farmer who barely scraped by, how Thomas had dreamed of something more, of wide open spaces and the freedom to build something of his own. He had headed west as soon as he was old enough, working whatever jobs he could find until he landed in Wyoming and fell in love with the rugged landscape. Delilah shared her own stories of growing up as an only child to loving but strict parents, how she had always loved learning and convinced her father to let her attend normal school to become a teacher, the joy she had found in educating young minds, and the devastation of watching her parents succumb to illness one after the other, powerless to help them. "I felt so lost after they died," she confessed one Wednesday afternoon. "Like I had no purpose anymore. Coming here to Margaret was supposed to be a fresh start, but I did not expect to find you. You have given me hope again, Thomas." "You have done the same for me," Thomas said softly, very aware of Margaret's presence even though the older woman was industriously working on some embroidery in the corner. "I did not realize how lonely I was until I was not anymore." True to her word, Margaret made inquiries about Thomas around town. She spoke to the bank manager, who confirmed Thomas's ranch was profitable and his accounts in good standing. She talked to the owner of the general store, who said Thomas always paid his bills on time and was unfailingly polite. The minister who came through monthly vouched for his character, as did several of the other ranchers who dealt with him regularly. Satisfied, Margaret gradually loosened her restrictions. After a month, she allowed Thomas to take Delilah for short walks around town, though they had to stay in sight of the shop. After 2 months, he was permitted to take her to the church social, where they danced together for the first time, and Thomas thought his heart might burst from the joy of holding her in his arms. "You are a terrible dancer," Delilah teased as he stepped on her foot for the 3rd time. "I spent more time with cattle than people," Thomas admitted ruefully. "They do not require much in the way of fancy footwork." "I will teach you," Delilah promised. "We have time." They did have time, and Thomas treasured every moment of it. Winter began its slow retreat into spring, the snow melting to reveal the brown grass beneath. Thomas threw himself into his work on the ranch with renewed energy, building up his herd and making improvements to his property. Everything he did with an eye toward the future, toward the day when he could bring Delilah home as his wife. In late March, the circuit preacher came through for the Easter service. Thomas sat beside Delilah in the small church that served the community, acutely aware of her hand resting near his on the pew between them. After the service, as people lingered to socialize outside, Thomas drew the preacher aside. "Reverend, I wonder if I could speak with you about performing a wedding." The older man smiled knowingly. "Would this be for you and Miss Anderson by any chance?" "Yes, sir. I have not asked her yet, not officially, but I wanted to know you would be available. I know you only come through once a month." "I would be honored to marry you too," the Reverend said warmly. You have been courting her properly from what I hear. It does my heart good to see young people doing things right. Thank you, sir. I am planning to propose soon. If she says yes, would you be able to perform the ceremony when you are next in town? That will be late April, I believe. I will mark it in my calendar. Just send word to confirm. With the preacher's blessing secured, Thomas spent the next week in a state of nervous anticipation. He wanted the proposal to be special, memorable, something Delilah would cherish. He had already bought a ring from the jeweler in town, a simple gold band with a small sapphire that had cost him nearly a month's profits, but was worth every penny. Finally, on a warm Sunday afternoon in early April, Thomas asked Margaret for permission to take Delilah on a picnic outside of town. He had proven himself trustworthy over the past months, and Margaret agreed with only mild reluctance. Have her back before sunset, she instructed. And Thomas, I think you are good for her. Whatever you are planning, you have my blessing. Thomas thanked her, knowing somehow that Margaret had guessed his intentions. He collected Delilah, who looked lovely in a yellow dress Margaret had made for her, and drove them out to a spot he had scouted earlier in the week. It was a meadow about 2 miles from town, carpeted in early spring wildflowers and overlooking a creek that sparkled in the sunlight. "Oh, Thomas, it is beautiful," Delilah breathed as he helped her down from the wagon. "I thought you might like it," Thomas said, spreading out a blanket and unpacking the basket of food he had assembled with more care than he had ever given any task. They ate cold chicken and fresh bread, cheese and early strawberries Margaret had contributed. They talked and laughed, and Thomas tried to memorize every detail of the moment. When the food was cleared away and they sat side by side on the blanket watching the water flow past, Thomas knew it was time. His heart hammered against his ribs as he shifted to face her. "Delilah, there is something I need to ask you." She turned to him, her expression growing serious as she saw whatever showed on his face. "All right." Thomas took both her hands in his, grounding himself with the physical connection. "4 months ago, I found you in the snow half frozen and terrified. I brought you home and took care of you because it was the right thing to do. But somewhere along the way, you became more than just someone I was helping. You became the most important person in my world. These past months of courting you have been the best of my life, but they are not enough anymore. I want every day with you, Delilah. I want to wake up next to you and fall asleep beside you. I want to build a life together and grow old together. I want to make sure you never feel cold or alone or afraid ever again." He released one of her hands to pull the ring from his pocket. "Delilah Anderson, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Delilah's face, but she was smiling so broadly it made Thomas's chest ache. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Thomas, of course I will marry you. I have been waiting for you to ask." Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest as if he could press her right into his heart. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I know I have not said it before, but I do. I love you so much." "I love you too," Delilah said, pulling back just enough to look at his face. "I think I started falling for you that first night when you read to me from your chair. You were so gentle and patient. I knew then that you were someone special." Thomas cupped her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time, a sweet, gentle meeting of lips that sent warmth flooding through his entire body. It was a kiss full of promise and hope, and all the dreams they would build together. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing a bit unsteadily, Delilah laughed. "Margaret is going to be insufferable. She has been predicting this for weeks." "She gave me her blessing," Thomas admitted. "I asked her permission before we left today." "You did everything right," Delilah said softly. You have been so patient and proper with me. I appreciate that more than you know. I wanted everyone to know that I am serious about you, about us. I want to marry you in the church with the whole town watching so there can never be any question that you are my wife, that we built this together on a foundation of respect and love." "When?" Delilah asked, practical even in her joy. "I spoke to the Reverend. He will be back through on the last Sunday of April. That gives us 3 weeks to prepare, if that is enough time for you." "3 weeks," Delilah repeated, looking a bit dazed. "That is so soon." "We can wait longer if you want," Thomas said quickly. "I do not want to rush you." "No," Delilah said, shaking her head. "No, 3 weeks is perfect. I do not want to wait any longer than necessary either. Besides, Margaret will have conniptions trying to make me a dress in that time, and I will enjoy watching her fuss." They stayed in the meadow until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, talking about their plans. They would live at Thomas's ranch, which Delilah had not yet seen since that first delirious time. Thomas promised to hire a woman from town to come help with the heavier housework, so Delilah would not be overwhelmed. They talked about eventually expanding the house, adding rooms for the children they both wanted. When Thomas finally drove Delilah back to town, she was wearing his ring and they were both giddy with happiness. Margaret took one look at them and clapped her hands together. "Finally! I was beginning to think you would never get around to it, Thomas Ashford. Come in, come in. We must celebrate properly." The next 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Margaret threw herself into creating a wedding dress for Delilah, a beautiful confection of ivory silk and lace that she insisted on making as her gift to her cousin. Thomas worked frantically to get his house ready, enlisting his ranch hands to help him give the place a thorough cleaning and make some long-needed repairs. He had new curtains made for the windows and bought a beautiful quilt for their bed. The whole town seemed to catch wedding fever. Thomas was stopped constantly by people offering congratulations and advice. The women of the church organized to prepare food for the reception that would follow the ceremony. Thomas's neighbors promised to help with his ranch work so he could take a few days for a honeymoon, though he and Delilah had decided to spend it at the ranch rather than traveling. They wanted to begin their married life in the home they would share. The night before the wedding, Thomas lay awake in his bed, too excited to sleep. Tomorrow his life would change forever. Tomorrow Delilah would become his wife. The thought filled him with a joy so profound it was almost frightening. He had never imagined he could be this happy, that he could find someone who fit so perfectly into his life and his heart. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, one of those perfect spring mornings when the air smelled of new grass and possibility. Thomas dressed in his best suit, which he had bought specially for the occasion, and rode into town with his hands shaking on the reins. The church was already filling with people when he arrived, neighbors and fellow ranchers and townspeople who had known him for years. His ranch hands were there in their Sunday best, grinning at him. And then the moment came when the doors at the back of the church opened and Delilah appeared on Margaret's arm. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. She was radiant in her white dress, her dark hair pinned up with small flowers woven through it. As she walked down the aisle toward him, her eyes locked on his, Thomas felt tears prick his own eyes. This woman, this beautiful, brave woman, had chosen him, had agreed to spend her life with him. It was more than he deserved. Delilah reached his side and took his hands, and Thomas was dimly aware of the Reverend beginning to speak, but all his attention was on her, on the smile that curved her lips and the love that shone in her eyes. He made his vows in a voice that only shook slightly, promising to love and cherish her, to protect her and provide for her, to honor her all the days of his life. And when Delilah spoke her own vows, promising to love and honor him, to be his partner and his helpmeet. Thomas felt something shift deep in his chest, a settling into place as if this was what he had been meant for all along. The reverend pronounced them man and wife, and Thomas kissed his bride there in the church with the whole town watching, pouring everything he felt into that kiss. The congregation erupted into applause and cheers. They were married. Delilah was his wife. Thomas felt like he could conquer the world. The reception was a joyous affair with music and dancing and more food than Thomas had seen in one place in years. He and Delilah were toasted and congratulated until Thomas's face hurt from smiling. But finally, as the afternoon began to wane into evening, they were able to slip away. Thomas helped his wife into the wagon, still marveling at the word, and they headed out toward the ranch. "Are you nervous?" Thomas asked as they drove, glancing at Delilah beside him. She considered the question, then shook her head. "No, I know I should be perhaps, but I am not." "I trust you, Thomas. I know you will take care of me." "Always," Thomas promised, "for the rest of my life." The ranch looked beautiful in the late afternoon light, the house Thomas had worked so hard to prepare waiting to welcome them. He helped Delilah down from the wagon and swept her up into his arms, making her laugh as he carried her across the threshold into their home. "There," he said, setting her gently on her feet. "Now it is official. Welcome home, Mrs. Ashford." Delilah looked around the main room with shining eyes, taking in all the small touches Thomas had added. "You have made it so lovely." "Oh, Thomas, is that the chair you sat in that first night?" "It is," Thomas confirmed. "I could not bring myself to get rid of it. Too many memories." "Good memories," Delilah said, walking over to run her hand along its worn back. "This is where everything started, where you took care of me and I began to fall in love with you without even realizing it." Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "I fell in love with you that first night too," he admitted. "When you opened your eyes and looked at me, something in my heart just knew. It terrified me, how quickly you became important to me." Delilah turned in his arms to face him. "I am here now. You do not have to be terrified anymore. We have the rest of our lives together." Thomas kissed her then, slowly and thoroughly, and they spent their wedding night wrapped in each other's arms, learning the geography of each other's bodies, murmuring words of love in the darkness. And when Delilah shivered at one point, Thomas immediately pulled the quilts higher around them. "Never again," he whispered against her hair. "I promised you would never be cold again, and I meant it. I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you are warm and safe and loved." "I know you will," Delilah said, snuggling closer to his warmth. "My rescuer, my husband, my love." The days that followed settled into a rhythm that brought Thomas more contentment than he had known was possible. He rose early each morning to tend to his cattle and horses, but now he had Delilah to come home to. She transformed the ranch house into a true home, adding small feminine touches that made everything feel warmer and more welcoming. She planted a garden behind the house, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the soil. She became friends with the ranch hands, mothering them in a way that made them fiercely loyal to her. Thomas's operation prospered under his renewed energy and focus. He bought more land, expanded his herd, and earned a reputation as one of the most successful ranchers in the territory. But all his success meant nothing compared to the joy of coming home each evening to Delilah's smile and her kiss. That first summer together was magical. They rode out together across the range, Thomas showing Delilah every corner of the land that was now hers as much as his. They had picnics in the meadows and swam in the creek when the days grew hot. They sat on the porch in the evenings, Delilah reading aloud while Thomas whittled or mended tack, just enjoying each other's company. In late August, Delilah came to Thomas with news that made his heart soar. "I am with child," she said, her eyes bright with joy and a touch of nervousness. "The baby should come sometime in early March." Thomas let out a whoop of joy and spun her around, making her laugh and scold him for being reckless. He set her down gently, suddenly afraid he had been too rough. "Are you all right? Should you be resting? What do you need?" "I need you to stop treating me like I am made of glass," Delilah said, but she was smiling. "I am pregnant, not ill. Women have babies all the time." "Not my woman," Thomas said, cupping her face in his hands. "Not my baby. This is different. This is the most important thing in the world." He was attentive to the point of being overbearing throughout Delilah's pregnancy, to her alternating amusement and annoyance. He insisted she rest frequently, brought her tea and special treats from town, and worried constantly about her health. Delilah bore his hovering with patience, knowing it came from love. As her belly grew round with their child, Thomas would lie with his hand on her stomach, feeling the baby kick and move. "Hello in there," he would whisper. "I am your pa. I cannot wait to meet you. Your ma and we are going to love you so much." Winter came again, and Thomas made sure the house was stocked with enough firewood and supplies to last through any storm. He remembered too well finding Delilah nearly frozen in the snow, and he was determined that neither she nor their child would ever suffer from the cold. The bedroom was always toasty warm. The stove kept burning day and night. Delilah's labor began on a chilly March morning, right on schedule. Thomas rode into town to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. Then he paced outside the bedroom door, nearly out of his mind with worry as he listened to Delilah's cries of pain. He wanted to be with her, to hold her hand, but Mrs. Henderson had shooed him out firmly. After what felt like an eternity but was really only about 6 hours, a baby's cry pierced the air. Thomas froze, his heart hammering. A moment later, Mrs. Henderson opened the door with a smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Ashford. You have a fine, healthy son." A son. Thomas had a son. He stumbled into the room where Delilah lay propped up on pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up as he approached, tears streaming down her face. "Thomas, meet your son. Meet Daniel." Thomas sat carefully on the edge of the bed, staring down at the tiny red face visible among the blankets. Daniel. They had chosen the name weeks ago, along with Dorothy if the baby had been a girl. His son. His boy. Thomas touched one impossibly small hand with a trembling finger, and the baby's tiny fingers curled reflexively around it. Something in Thomas's chest cracked open, flooded with a love so fierce it was almost painful. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Delilah. Thank you for him, for this, for everything." "We made him together," Delilah said softly. "Our miracle." Thomas learned the routines of fatherhood over the following weeks, changing nappies and walking the floor at night when Daniel fussed. He marveled at how small his son was, how fragile and perfect. And he watched Delilah become a mother, saw the fierce, protective love in her eyes when she nursed their baby, and fell in love with her all over again. Spring turned to summer, and Daniel grew from a tiny infant into a chubby baby with Thomas's blue eyes and Delilah's dark hair. He was a happy child, quick to smile and laugh. Thomas would carry him around the ranch, showing him the horses and cattle, telling him all about the operation he would one day inherit. "He is too young to understand," Delilah protested with amusement one afternoon, watching from the porch as Thomas walked around with Daniel perched on his hip, pointing out various features of the ranch. "Never too young to start learning," Thomas called back. "Right, son. You are going to be a rancher just like your pa." Or a scholar or a doctor or whatever he wants to be, Delilah said when Thomas returned to the porch. Let him choose his own path. Of course, Thomas agreed, bouncing Daniel gently. He can be anything he wants. As long as he is happy and good, that is all I care about. The years flowed by, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their family. When Daniel was 2, Delilah gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Dorothy. She had her mother's brown eyes and a temperament as sweet as honey. Thomas adored her, this tiny girl who wrapped him around her little finger from the moment she was born. 2 years after Dorothy came another son, James, who proved to be a holy terror from the moment he could crawl. He was into everything, fearless and curious, giving Delilah gray hairs before she turned 30. But he was also loving and loyal, quick to defend his siblings and fierce in his devotions. Thomas's ranch continued to prosper, and he used the profits to improve their home and their lives. He added on to the house, giving them more room for their growing family. He hired help so Delilah would not be overwhelmed by the work of caring for 3 young children. And through it all, his love for his wife only deepened and grew. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Delilah back to the meadow where he had proposed. Margaret watched the children for the afternoon, allowing them a rare day alone together. They spread out a blanket in the same spot and ate a picnic lunch, and Thomas looked at his wife, 10 years older than the girl he had found in the snow, but even more beautiful to him. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "The life you could have had if that stage had not crashed. You could have been a dressmaker in town, independent and comfortable. Instead, you are stuck out here with a rancher and 3 wild children." Delilah looked at him with surprise, then reached over to take his hand. "Thomas Ashford, I have never regretted a single moment. You gave me more than I ever dreamed of having. You gave me a home and a family and a love that sustains me every day. That stage crashing was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it brought me to you." "I am the one who got lucky," Thomas said. "Finding you that day changed my whole life. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You taught me how to really live." "We saved each other," Delilah said simply. "You pulled me from the snow and I pulled you from your loneliness. We built this beautiful life together, and I would not change a single thing about it." Thomas pulled her close and kissed her there in the meadow where he had asked her to marry him a decade before, the same passion and love burning between them as it had that day. They lay together on the blanket, talking about their children and their plans for the future, grateful for everything they had built. As the years continued to pass, Thomas and Delilah watched their children grow. Daniel became a serious, responsible young man who did indeed love ranching and took to the work with natural skill. Dorothy was gentle and artistic, with a gift for music that led Thomas to buy her a piano that had to be hauled all the way from Cheyenne. James was the wild one, always getting into scrapes, but with a heart of gold that meant no one could stay mad at him for long. Thomas taught his sons everything he knew about working the land and raising cattle. He taught them to ride and rope, to read the weather and care for the animals. He taught them about honor and hard work and treating people fairly. And he taught them, through his example with Delilah, how to love and respect a woman. Delilah taught her children to read and write, giving them the education she had valued so highly. She taught Dorothy to sew and cook, but also encouraged her musical gifts. She taught all of them kindness and compassion and the importance of family. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful operations in Wyoming. But Thomas never forgot where he had come from, the lean early years when he had nothing. He and Delilah were generous with their neighbors, helping out families that fell on hard times, contributing to the church and the school. They became pillars of the community, respected and liked by all who knew them. When Daniel was 20, he married a sweet girl from town named Emma, and Thomas and Delilah became grandparents to a little girl named Sarah. The joy of holding his granddaughter brought tears to Thomas's eyes. He thought about that night so many years ago when he had ridden through the blizzard and found Delilah in the snow. If he had taken a different path, if he had been even a few minutes later, none of this would exist. His children, his grandchildren, this whole beautiful life would never have been. "What are you thinking about?" Delilah asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Their hair was gray now, their faces lined with age, but Thomas still found her as beautiful as she had been at 22. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Thomas said. "How one moment, one choice can change everything. If I had not gone to that meeting in town that day, if I had left earlier or later, if I had taken a different route home, I would have missed you. I would have lived my whole life alone and never known what I was missing. But you did find me," Delilah said, reaching for his hand. "And I found you. We were meant for each other, Thomas. I truly believe that. God put me in that storm and put you on that road at exactly the right time because He knew we were meant to be together." "I never felt the cold that night," Thomas said. "Even though the snow was blinding and the wind was howling, all I felt was the need to get you to safety. You were my responsibility from that first moment I saw you lying there, and you have been ever since. Taking care of you, making sure you never feel cold or alone or afraid, it is not a burden. It is my privilege. It is what I was put on this earth to do." "You have done that and so much more," Delilah said softly. "You have given me warmth and love and security every single day for over 30 years. You kept your promise, Thomas. I have never felt cold since that night. How could I when I have your love to warm me?" They sat together in the fading light, hands clasped, hearts full. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family, Dorothy playing the piano while James's children ran around laughing. It was a good life, a full life, built on the foundation of love and commitment they had forged in the aftermath of that winter storm so long ago. As the years advanced further, Thomas and Delilah gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Daniel while they enjoyed a slower pace. They spent their time with their grandchildren, taking joy in watching the next generation grow. They traveled a bit, taking the train to Denver and even San Francisco, marveling at how much the world had changed since they were young. But they always came home to Wyoming, to the ranch that Thomas had built and Delilah had turned into a home. It was where they belonged, where their roots ran deep, where their children and grandchildren came for Sunday dinners and holidays, filling the house with love and laughter. On their 40th anniversary, their children threw them a party that half the county attended. People came from miles around to celebrate Thomas and Delilah, to toast their enduring love and the family they had built. Thomas stood to give a speech, his voice still strong despite his 70 years. "40 years ago, I found a woman half frozen in the snow," he began. "I brought her home and cared for her, never imagining that she would become the center of my universe. Delilah, you have been my partner, my love, my best friend. You have given me children and grandchildren, and a life richer than I ever dreamed possible. Every day with you has been a gift. I promised you all those years ago that I would never let you feel cold again, and I have tried my best to keep that promise. But what I did not know then was that you would do the same for me. You have warmed my life in ways I cannot even express. I love you more today than I did 40 years ago, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." There was not a dry eye in the room as Delilah stood and kissed her husband, both of them beaming through their tears. The party continued late into the night, filled with music and dancing and stories of the life Thomas and Delilah had shared. As they grew older still, their health began to fail, as it must for everyone. Thomas developed arthritis that made working difficult, and Delilah's eyesight dimmed. But they faced these challenges together, as they had faced everything, supporting and caring for each other. Their children and grandchildren rallied around them, making sure they wanted for nothing on a cold winter morning, very much like the one when he had found her. Thomas woke to find Delilah watching him with love in her still bright eyes. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the world in white, and the bedroom was warm from the fire their grandson had built up earlier. "Good morning, my love," Delilah said softly. "Good morning," Thomas replied, reaching for her hand. His joints ached and his body felt heavy, but his heart was light. "It snowed again." "It did," Delilah said. "Just like that first night. Do you remember?" "I remember everything," Thomas said. "Every moment, every word, it is all precious to me." They lay together in the warm bed, watching the snow fall outside the window, and Thomas felt profoundly grateful. He had been given more than most men could hope for. A long life, a loving wife, healthy children and grandchildren, work he enjoyed, and a home he cherished. Most of all, he had been given love, deep and true and lasting. "Are you warm enough?" Thomas asked, the question he had asked Delilah thousands of times over the decades. "Always, my darling," Delilah replied with the answer she always gave. "With you beside me, I am always warm." Thomas lived to see his 80th birthday, celebrated with 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and even 3 great-grandchildren. He passed peacefully in his sleep on a warm summer night with Delilah holding his hand, her whispered words of love the last thing he heard. She followed him less than a year later, unable to bear life without her other half. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a large oak tree Thomas had planted the year they were married. Their children commissioned a headstone that read, "Thomas Ashford and Delilah Ashford, beloved husband and wife. He found her in the snow and carried her home. Together they built a legacy of love." The ranch stayed in the family for generations, passed down from parent to child, a testament to what Thomas and Delilah had built together. And their descendants, who grew up hearing the story of how their great-great-grandparents met, never forgot the lesson at the heart of it all. That love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. That one act of kindness and compassion can change the course of a life. That the choice to care for another person, to protect them and cherish them, is the most important choice anyone can make. Years after Thomas and Delilah were gone, their great-granddaughter stood in the ranch house, now updated with electricity and indoor plumbing, but still fundamentally the same building Thomas had constructed with his own hands. She held the worn journal that Delilah had kept throughout her life, reading the entry from that first night. "I do not know the name of the man who saved me," Delilah had written in a shaky hand, still weak from her ordeal. "But I owe him my life. He rode through a blizzard to bring me to safety. He cared for me with such gentleness, such patience. I think I am already half in love with him, though that is foolish. I am grateful to be alive. I am grateful for his kindness, and I am so very grateful to be warm again." A few pages later, written after their wedding, "Thomas promised me I would never feel cold again, and he has kept that promise every day. But it is not just physical warmth he provides. His love warms my soul, my heart, my very being. I was lost in the snow, freezing and alone, and he found me. He carried me home. And now, for the rest of my life, I will be warm and safe and loved. What more could anyone ask for?" The great-granddaughter closed the journal with tears in her eyes, understanding now the depth of what her ancestors had shared. It was not just a love story, though it was certainly that. It was a testament to the power of choosing love every single day, of keeping promises, of building something lasting and true. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall again, soft and gentle this time, not the killing blizzard that had nearly taken Delilah's life all those decades ago. The ranch was quiet in the winter evening, the cattle safe in the barns, the land resting until spring. But inside the house that Thomas had built and Delilah had made a home, warmth and love still lingered, as much a part of the structure as the wood and nails. The story of Thomas and Delilah lived on, passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the coldest moments can lead to the warmest love. That rescue can come from unexpected places. That a single act of compassion can ripple forward through time, touching lives not yet born. And if you stood very still in that old ranch house on a winter evening, some said you could almost hear it, the echo of Thomas's deep voice reading aloud while Delilah listened from her bed. The sound of her laughter as he stepped on her foot during a dance. The whispered promises exchanged in the darkness. The love that had warmed two hearts for a lifetime and continued to warm all who came after. Because Thomas had found Delilah stranded in the snow, carried her home, and never let her feel cold again. And in return, she had given him everything that made life worth living. Together they had created something that would last far beyond their mortal years, a legacy built not of wealth or fame but of simple, steadfast, enduring love. The kind of love that conquers cold and distance, and even death itself. The kind of love that transforms a lonely cowboy and a lost young woman into partners who would build an empire together. The kind of love that starts with one person seeing another in need and choosing, against all reason and practicality, to help. Thomas Ashford had ridden through a blizzard on a December day in 1885 and found more than a woman in need of rescue. He had found his future, his family, his forever. And Delilah Anderson had been lost in the snow and found more than shelter. She had found home. Their children told the story to their children, who told it to theirs. The ring Thomas had given Delilah was passed down through the generations, along with the carved wooden bird and the pressed flowers. Physical tokens of a love that needed no proof, but that left traces anyway, like footprints in snow that somehow never melted. And so the story ended where it began, with snow falling on Wyoming and love warming a home on the range, with promises kept and vows honored, with two lives intertwined so completely that even death could not fully separate them. Thomas and Delilah Ashford, the cowboy and the woman he found in the snow, who together proved that the coldest nights can lead to the warmest tomorrows, and that true love, once found, burns eternal.